Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. When watching popular movies about hackers, cyberspace, data breach or security compromise, it is very exciting and there is always someone who saves a country or the world. However, the reality of cybersecurity is very different. Usually it's hours, if not days, of analyzing certain patterns of behavior, almost super boring until something happens. So what does cybersecurity mean in 2024? What does cybersecurity mean for especially UK in the global context? Those are topics or questions we're going to explore with my guest today, who is Dr. Gareth Mott. Hello, Gareth.
Good afternoon, Martin.
Gareth is a research fellow in the cyber team at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security, also known as RUSI. His research interests include governance and cybersecurity, the challenges of peer-to-peer technologies, development in the cyber risk landscape, and also the evolution of cybersecurity strategies at various levels. So let's start with the first question, and this is the sort of basic questions I always discuss with my students. And that's the physical world and the cyber world. So when we understand borders, sovereignty, and the governments in the physical world, how do we understand the cyberspace? And is it in the same way? So is there the UK cyberspace? Is there German cyberspace? Or how does it work, Gareth?
That's a really important question. Historically, in kind of academia, and I suppose in strategic circles, people spoke of cyberspace as the fifth sphere of power projection. So the previous four would be land, sea, air, and space, and then a fifth sphere of power projection, which would be cyberspace. Now, unlike the prior four spaces, which are kind of preordained, they were here before us and were last a lot beyond us. Cyberspace is unique in that it was human-made. We have created this space. Now, in some ways it's unique, in some ways it links into the other four spaces. So cyberspace is in land, sea, air, and space. I think in popular culture, when we think of the internet and we use terms like the cloud, for example, it makes it feel like the internet is around us and it's an ethereal thing in the air. To some extent, it can be in the air because it's in radio signals. For example, Wi-Fi, for example, uses forms of radio signals. But ultimately, cyberspace is tangibly linked to physical infrastructure. Cyberspace is mostly cables, metal, silicon, like masses and masses of cables, including undersea cables called submarine cables that go along the seabed, joining up continents in a similar way to what telegraph cables used to do way back when. And so you've got two spaces there, the physical and the what we call the information, so the data. Now, in the absence of the physical infrastructure, the data can't be channeled. Right, so the data can't move. So but without the information, cyberspace is just a load of equipment that doesn't do anything. So the agency, i.e., the information, gives it a significance. So it's simultaneously a physical space, but also a less tangible space that deals with the dissemination of information. That has important implications in terms of how we see it, in terms of navigating borders. Is it bordered? Is it borderless? It's both at the same time. How do states interact in their sovereignty in the space? Again, they have sovereignty, but at the same time, if it's partly a borderless space, given the seamless interaction and connectivity, then the nature of the sovereignty will be different, right? And in terms of governance, like this is we can discuss the history of the internet if you like, but if the internet had parents, it's a military brat. It was born out of a military-facing project linked to DARPA before it became a more civilian-facing sphere. But ultimately, today it's governed mostly by NGOs. It is run predominantly by private corporations. It's not run by governments. But governments have a role to play in governing it within their border and also finding ways to govern it at an international level. So in terms of whether there is a UK cyberspace, yes and no is the blunt, horrible answer. I mean, obviously, we have UK ISPs, internet service providers, that give us the connectivity. These are mostly kind of UK companies. We have UK laws that govern how we can use or not use the internet within the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom. But at the same time, if we had a UK cyberspace, that would be an intranet. It would be an internal facing network that you could access within, and probably only within, the United Kingdom. What we have is an internet, which is all kind of hosts and network devices connecting up to the same digital environment, operating on the same open standards, which are themselves governed by the NGOs. And so to that extent, there probably isn't a UK cyberspace per se. There is just a cyberspace.
How do you see those activities of countries, for instance, like China or Russia, that are already speaking about Chinese internet, Russian internet? So is there a trend of having more divided internet, or is it still global in a sense? Because now we have those sanctions, especially regarding to Russia, and we are reading those articles how services stopped working in Russia. And then people are wondering, was that decided by the company or the Russian government, or how does it work? So therefore, like that's quite interesting, that segmentation of the internet. And what's your views on that?
So it's a great question. It makes me think of a recent article we've just drafted. I don't want to say too much because it's not yet published and hasn't gone for peer review yet, but I've completed the draft. And this is by myself, Tom Hjornsmeyer, and Jason Nurse at the University of Kent, considering whether the Russian Federation views cyberspace as a bordered entity, and how does cyberspace interact with its perception of being a kind of vulnerable country with kind of quite porous borders. And one of the interesting things, for example, that the Russians have done is there's a .ru domain, right? So the Russian domain, they've introduced laws where you have to demonstrate that you are based in Russia, that you're a Russian entity, company or individual, before you can either get a new RU domain or maintain your existing one. So basically kind of linking your geographical status or your biometric status to the ownership of their domain, which is interesting. Obviously, in China, historically, we've talked about that kind of Great Firewall of China and the kind of restrictions in place. So we've seen that kind of, often what that comes in is in the form of blacklisting. So that means that you, as a government, either you run the internet service providers yourself, or you have significant influence in terms of being a legal jurisdiction over ISPs that are based in your jurisdiction. And so you can turn to those internet service providers and say, okay, if you have clients or users who are connected to your internet service and they try to connect to a particular domain, let's say that's Twitter, or let's say that's Facebook or PayPal or whatever, don't let them do that. So block that connectivity. So it's not that they're taking down the website. It's just that for users on the given ISP, they find that they can't access those services. Now, there's ways around that. You can use the Tor network. You could use possibly a VPN service to obfuscate that, encrypt the traffic, and find another way to access it. But fundamentally, that is one way of prohibiting access. That isn't necessarily disconnecting from the internet. It's still a cyberspace. But I think at the moment we're seeing ongoing deliberations at, in particular, for example, the United Nations level, in terms of trying to identify ways to, implement new governance systems for cyberspace. And here we're seeing contentions around how cyber threats are defined, for example, and the Russians, for example. It's interesting if you look at the Russian kind of strategy documents, where they talk about national risks and so forth. They talk about information security rather than cybersecurity. In the United Kingdom, for example, or the United States, we'll talk about cybersecurity, which means more kind of the digital risks like malware, that kind of thing. In the Russian context, they include the malware, but they're also including, disinformation and misinformation as incorporated within their kind of information security space. So there's different interpretations there, and when you kind of meet at international forums and try to debate less kind of common understanding, it's a bit like when you have debates around terrorism. And of course, you had Lee Jarvis, Professor Lee Jarvis, on in a previous episode, an eminent expert in terrorism studies. But there is no kind of overarching definition of terrorism. And likewise, when you enter this space, again, different countries have different interpretations of the same technologies and similar uses of the technologies. Now, there's a question as to whether the status quo is sustainable. So the status quo is that there is governance of the technology and the use of technology. We could argue that the governance is behind the technology development. So our ability to develop new technologies, whether it's the internet itself, whether it's the World Wide Web, whether it is generative AI, for example, our ability as humankind and researchers and scientists to develop these technologies often exceeds our ability to find ways to meaningfully govern them. And this kind of a process has been happening for arguably since the late 20th century. I don't necessarily see that changing. I suspect that our ability to govern will always be playing catch up. But if countries find that, their critical national infrastructure is increasingly connected up to a space that they deem to be vulnerable, there's a question as to whether then the status quo is not sustainable. And if they can't implement meaningful governance regimes, do we go to a fragmentation of the internet? I don't think that's likely. But in that case, you could have kind of a debate around where is sovereignty in cyberspace, and do countries need to switch to more kind of intranet-based services rather than internet-based services? That would degrade the value of the internet, frankly. Like the fact that it is a global system governed by open standards itself gives cyberspace its value. So I don't see us going towards a fragmentation. It might not be within my lifetime, but possibly the lifetime of your audience. As we move towards debates around transhumanism, and it isn't that we have a device that goes in our pocket. If the device is integrated into our bodies, our brains, and so forth, that opens obviously opens up new vectors of attack. That opens up a new landscape of vulnerability at a societal level. Again, that might feed debates as to what networks need to be connected to a cyberspace and what networks need to be connected to something more insular.
There are so many threats that we read about threats and the cybersecurity. Some of them, they represent sort of serious threats, and some of them are just sort of cover story and people are trying to inflate the meaning of them. And what sort of threats is UK dealing at the moment? Maybe we can mention, let's say, top 3, 4.
So when you think about risk and threat, one of the things you can do, which is quite helpful, is to create a risk matrix. So like a grid, and on one axis you have kind of probability, likelihood of it occurring, and on the other axis being severity. So if it happens, if the threat becomes a genuine incident, how severe is it? How impactful is it? So obviously, if the worst case scenario is something that is very likely to happen and is extremely severe, in reality, often you don't get that kind of that risk materializing. What you get are very common risks that happen quite routinely, but might be low severity and kind of low probability incidents that could potentially be very, very severe. I think we, in the UK, we'll see both of those types of threat to different entities, so both government, private sector, civilians, and so on. Like we are, the UK, for example, in the latest national cybersecurity strategy, articulated cybersecurity as a whole of society effort, and I think that articulates the pragmatic sense that anyone connected to cyberspace can potentially be a victim of an incident, and also if we're collectively going to work towards reducing the likelihood of the attack occurring or incident occurring, but when something does occur, being able to bounce back, we call that resiliency. That has to be a whole of society effort, and that partly comes down to resourcing as well from the government's perspective. So in terms of the main risks that we're seeing today, a high level risk that is probably lowish probability but could be quite severe would be kind of major espionage activity of a destructive kind. against UK assets. So we see espionage routinely. The UK does it. Our adversaries do it. Our allies do it. We kind of snoop on each other. Like so, intelligence gathering. I mean, this is a normal function of a modern nation state, arguably. Obviously, we should be concerned about that, but ultimately, where it's intelligence gathering, it's not destructive. I'd suggest that that's more routine. But if a kind of motivated adversary got access to, for example, critical national infrastructure systems and conducted a destructive attack, that could be quite a severe incident. If you go on the National Cybersecurity Centre's website, they have a classification that runs, I think, from off the top of my head, from 1 to 9 or 1 to 10, 1 being the most severe and 9 or 10 being the least severe incident. That gives you a sense of how the UK PLC define cyber risk and the severity. So 1 being basically everything is broken. It's a major complete disaster, all the way down to, okay, something might be happening, but it's low level, just monitor it. And in each of those stages, there's different levels of anticipated UK government response. So at the top level, there'll be COBRA meetings in central government. The NCSC, GCHQ, for example, might be involved in trying to remediate. And as you go down the tiers of threat, there'll be less of a kind of a government-led response to the incident. At RUSI, we've done a lot of research in recent years on ransomware. So this is a form of cybercrime. So typically, some of the groups might be linked or semi-linked to nation states, but typically this is a non-nation state activity. This is a cybercrime group activity which arguably the first iterations of ransomware date back to something like 1989, where they were distributed at a computer conference via floppy disks. Really, when we talk about ransomware, we're talking about what has happened since about 2015 onwards and has escalated since then. So typically the attacker will get access to your systems. They will encrypt the systems. So encryption is good. We like encryption, right? It keeps our communications secure. It keeps our transactions secure. But we need encryption. But at the same time, a malicious actor who gets access to your systems can use encryption in a malicious way where they scramble your data or your computer system and then demand money from you, typically in the form of a cryptocurrency, in order for them to provide you the private key that would decrypt the system and partially fix it. Increasingly, the threat actors have not only encrypted, they've also stolen data in advance of the encryption event, and then threaten to sell the data that they've gotten access to or just leak it on their darknet websites if the victim doesn't pay a demanded ransom. So sometimes they do both encryption and exfiltration. Sometimes now it's just exfiltration rather than encryption. This is a really nasty form of cybercrime because it's worked as far as the cyber criminals are concerned and have been able to make significant amounts of money from it. More groups have sprung up. They've invested their proceeds into their attack techniques. They've developed kind of affiliate programs. So rather than doing everything in-house, they might sell their malware to other groups or other users, or they might buy access. So they're not doing the initial kind of breach of a system. They buy that from someone else and give that person or entity a proceeds of the crime if a ransom is eventually paid. So it's diversified, it's become more intrinsic. And so UK companies amongst American companies, Western European companies, but increasingly companies in, for example, Latin America, Middle East and so forth, are victims of this pernicious cybercrime. Now, there's a question there as to whether that can be a kind of tier 1 level threat if it's impacting critical national infrastructure. The answer is yes, it can. So in the case of the United States, for example, we saw Colonial Pipeline impacted by a ransomware incident a few years ago. This is a pipeline that feeds gasoline to about half the gasoline to the East Coast of the United States. The pipeline itself wasn't impacted, but computers run by the company were. They switched off the pipeline out of an abundance of caution, and gasoline prices in the United States shot up. It was declared a state of emergency. And actually, quite quickly after after that incident occurred, President Putin had a meeting with President Biden, and Biden kind of drew out a list of red lines and said, please don't, or don't allow entities within your jurisdiction to attack these critical national infrastructure targets in the United States, which is an interesting document. It's kind of like, if you want to hurt us, please, these are the sectors to target. But that kind of reached a geopolitical level quite quickly, and ransomware is a very interesting case study because it is arguably a failure of foreign policy, right? in the sense that a lot of the groups that are conducting this activity are based in Russian Federation or Iran, some of them in North Korea. We don't have great relations with these countries at the moment. We don't have much scope to kind of encourage them to do more to police this activity in the jurisdiction. Some of the Russian ransomware script, for example, if it hits a computer that has Cyrillic script, it won't deliver the payload. And so there's a sense that Putin gave a speech in, I think, 2017 in St. Petersburg, where he was sort of saying, crime groups in Russia, if you're attacking, I'm horribly paraphrasing, but crime groups in Russia, if you're attacking our shared adversaries, that's fine by me. That's fine by the Russian authorities. And this is kind of what we've been seeing, which is so long as the attackers don't breach too many red lines, they don't go too far, and upset geopolitics too much, they kind of have free rein to attack adversaries of the Russian Federation. And so there's not much of an incentive to clamp down on their activity. So it's kind of a failure of foreign policy, a failure of geopolitics that's impacting kind of organizations in the UK. Now, an individual incident might not, it's impactful for the company, the staff at the organization. We've done a lot of research where we've interviewed staff members at organizations who have been impacted by ransomware, and it can cause physiological and psychological harms to those staff. So it can be very detrimental to them. But maybe on an aggregate level, it's not that severe. But if you add up all those ransomware incidents, like hundreds and hundreds each in a given year, that adds up. There's a societal cost of that. I don't like the term, but maybe it's a case of a death by 1,000 cuts. So again, it's something that has scope to be very severe, often isn't particularly severe other than for the kind of main target entity. But if you add that up over a grand scheme of things, it's arguably quite a severe risk the UK faces.
And also, I would like to add one important thing about ransomware, and that's how easy it is to execute. For instance, I have an example from one private company, and the company had fantastic system in terms of cybersecurity. And they basically sent an email to some low-level assistant that your PDF reader needs update. And this is the link. And because it's very simple text, there was nothing suspicious and everything looked legit, like from the cybersecurity center of the company, because they use the same identity. The person just said, okay, just PDF reader, nothing important. So I click on the link. And he clicked on the link, and then everything started, and the whole company went down in terms of cybersecurity. So because people often associate cybersecurity with those movies of the hackers working in some underground facility with 60,000 people and equipment and special decoder. But in reality, ransomware offers a very easy way how to execute a major attack when you're thinking about cybersecurity. So I think, therefore, it is also very popular among attackers. But Gareth, let's clarify another thing. And then when we have a country, UK, what protects the country from those ransomwares? Is there any state layer security system that UK has, sort of like state firewall, or is it all based on the private companies?
I suppose it's a nuanced picture where it's a bit of both. It's a patchwork. So the UK doesn't have, nor does really any jurisdiction have the capacity to be the blue light service for cyber, or even the defensive force for cyber at a whole of society level. Like we simply can't fund that. We don't have the resources available for that. So again, that triaging that you see in the NCSC's classification is useful to get a sense of where the UK government feels able to, or feels an obligation to step in to a given incident. In terms of horizon scanning and keeping an eye on threat landscapes and stuff like that, the private sector does that. There's significant threat intelligence companies, like Mandiant, for example, which is run by Google, is a very large company. There's many other companies around who will do kind of horizon scanning to understand the threat intelligence picture, and they'll sell that to kind of clients, which might include government clients, but also private sector clients that they have. But at the same time, the government will do that themselves. They do have the capacity to horizon scan. There is a scheme called Active Cyber Defense, I want to say, run by the NCSC, where companies and organizations sign up to that service. And they might get, for example, a notification that an actor is trying to surveil their systems. So get like a tap on the shoulder, if you like, from an entity within government that sort of said, we believe something's happening. You might want to take a look. But at the same time, they might have on retainer, they might have, an incident response company and a cybersecurity firm that is doing the same thing, that also is keeping, running a kind of observation deck, if you like, to keep an eye on trends and threats that are impacting that company. Obviously, it's best if you can identify an possible incident occurring before it happens.
And also, if you can mention any institutions or organizations that are dealing with cybersecurity, because this is sort of unclear. Many people consider that only secret services are doing that. So this is what we would like to also clarify in this question.
So that's a great question. So in the United Kingdom, we don't have a minister of cyber. But cyber is involved in the Treasury's remit. It's involved in Home Office remit. It's involved in the MOD's remit. So lots of ministers have cyber within their portfolio, but there isn't a single point of contact for cyber. Obviously, the NCSC is the UK's CERT, so it's the kind of the emergency response kind of organization in the United Kingdom. It's a public-facing part of GCHQ, which is our signals intelligence organization. The NCA is involved in cyber in a very significant way. We saw, for example, early this year, one of the few major publicly known takedowns of a ransomware group, or partial takedowns of a ransomware group. That group was Lockbit. That was an NCA-led kind of an international operation, but the UK's NCA led on that operation, a significant success in the fight against ransomware. The NCA were a significant part of that. But also regional police as well, and local police have a role to play. Arguably, they don't have the resourcing to be a blue light service. Like if you have a cyber incident and you call the police, there isn't going to be much that they can do. They can give you a crime number, they can take down details. That's important because it feeds a national threat intelligence picture and helps those kind of takedowns that we saw with Lockbit. So the answer is there isn't a single point of contact for cyber as a patchwork. One other thing would be action fraud. So if you yourself individually are hit by a cyber incident, like you've got malware, or you've ransomware often is targeting organizations, but there are instances where ransomware targets individuals. You would typically report that to action fraud, which is kind of a bespoke portal for fraud activity. Cyber is bundled into that, at least at this point in time. And then from there, it will get triaged and taken through the system. So lots of different entities have a role for cyber without one single one having the ownership of it. Oh, and there's one more from National Cyber Force, NCF, in the United Kingdom. Also it conducts kind of offensive activity on behalf of the UK's interests. So, for example, disrupting terrorist groups and their kind of digital infrastructure.
Gareth, let's speak a little bit about cybersecurity strategy. The official name is the Government Cybersecurity Strategy 2022-2030. And we know it's built on two pillars. One pillar you already mentioned, and that's defend as one nation. And the second pillar is build a strong foundation of organizational cybersecurity resilience. And we don't want to go to details of this strategy because people can read it online. But my question would be, what are your views of the development of the cybersecurity strategy in the UK if you compare this strategy with the previous ones? What can you see? What sort of trends can you spot? And maybe you can add a bit sort of critical view as a researcher. How effective is this strategy?
So obviously we are still in the lifespan. We're still in the lifespan of the ongoing government cybersecurity strategy. I think the current one runs up until 2030. So it's still early days to make a kind of overarching assessment of where we are and how to metrify that meaningfully. It's important also to note that within the strategy kind of will outline overarching goals and kind of give a narration of the threats that we face within that time span and where we kind of want to be. But in terms of actually implementing that, that will often be in the form of kind of internal documents within Whitehall that might not possibly be released at a public level. And those you might see the kind of more clearer metrification in terms of how they're actually going to implement and assess and observe the success of those. So kind of as external reviewers, it can be quite tricky to understand where we are in terms of state of play. What I would say in terms of where we can situate this strategy in relation to previous strategies is that I would say that UK, but we've also seen this elsewhere, but in the UK we've seen a maturation of the cybersecurity strategies. In the UK, for example, we had the first bespoke cybersecurity strategy in 2011. So we had a national security strategy published in 2010, and then there was a cyber-specific one published in 2011, and then we've had bespoke cybersecurity strategies since. The kind of formation of a bespoke cybersecurity strategy was itself a maturation, understanding that this is a significant space, but also a unique space. But then, again, I think, for example, the kind of inclusion of the whole of society approach in the more recent versions of these documents, again, is kind of a mature expression of the fact that the government can't do this alone. Government isn't the only entity impacted. There are, what happens to UK PLC at large in terms of, the organisations of the United Kingdom can have greater impacts to wider society. So yeah, I think that there's been if you read the documents, and if you're interested in this space, I'd recommend to students to read through these documents or skim read them. So it's interesting to read the narratives and how these kind of the threats are described, for example, and articulated. I think, a maturation. I suspect we'll see that maturation continue over time as the kind of governments kind of continue to grapple with how they can navigate the current risk landscape.
When those strategies are written and conceptualized, usually those writers, researchers, and everyone who is working on the final version of the strategy, they work with the traditional deterrence theory. And my question would be, is that traditional approach to deterrence same for cyberspace as for the other dimensions? So
with deterrence, there's been an ongoing debate within kind of the cybersecurity realm from a kind of politics and international relations perspective is, does deterrence work in cyberspace? I mean, there's arguments on both sides, but I would steer more towards it's tricky, it's complicated, I suppose. So with thermonuclear weapons, for example, it wasn't immediately apparent that deterrence worked, right? It took arguably until the 1960s before states became to a certain agreements that these are deterrence-based weapons. You own them precisely to kind of stop your adversaries using them against you. But that norm of non-use took some time to develop. But importantly, for a deterrence to work, you have to have an overwhelming ability to strike back. You have to have a clear attribution, so you get to know clearly who has conducted the first strike against you so that you can quickly strike back. And ergo that means that neither party makes that first strike because the costs of doing so are too great. With cyber, attribution isn't always clear. It can take weeks or months to attribute, which is far too long. If the adversary is trying to hide who they are, if you invest enough time and resource, you can probably eventually figure out or get a good guess of who they are. But if that takes weeks or months, that's too long. If you want to strike back, how do you strike back? With nuclear weapons, it's quite clear. Like, to deter a nuclear weapon, you need an overwhelming conventional force, or ideally a thermal weapon of your own that you can launch back in kind. With cyber, do you launch back a cyber attack? If so, how? And how do you calibrate that? Do you speak about it? Do you acknowledge that you've done it? Do you attack back through kinetic, non-cyber means? And we've seen this kind of at NATO, at the NATO level. So NATO, obviously, as students might know, is kind of, it pivots around Article 5. An attack against one is an attack against all. There's a collective response to an attack on an individual NATO member state. That's what kind of gives NATO its crux, its value. But they've played this dance. And if you read kind of recent communiques from the summits at NATO, for example, in terms of how they're navigating cyber threats, they've played this dance, which is to keep kind of what we might call cultivated ambiguity in place. So we might strike back to a cyber incident, but we might not. They're kind of leaving that space open to navigate on a context by context, case by case basis, because they don't want to pin themselves down to saying we will commit, because that could be escalatory when they don't want to be escalatory. Nor do they want to say we wouldn't strike back, because that kind of foregoes Article 5. So in all honesty, and again, because of the other issues, which is the speed of cyber weapons, the ability to attack very quickly, the fact that anyone can feasibly develop a significant malware tool with enough time. They don't have to be a state actor. They don't have to be paid by the state. They can be an individual researcher, vulnerability research, for example. The kind of, there's been a dissolving of the barriers to ownership of offensive tools. Unlike, for example, like an aircraft carrier or an F-16 aircraft, I'm not going to have access to those as a researcher, but I could feasibly have access to offensive cyber tools. That further diminishes our ability to meaningfully attribute, and also, again, dissolves the concept around deterrence, which typically revolves around deterring state actors. So arguably, it isn't clear that we can deter in cyberspace. And going back to the previous question, that means it's even more important that we need resiliency in place to accept that sometimes a cyber incident will occur, whether intentional or unintentional, accidental or purposeful, and you just need to bounce back as quickly as possible if you get impacted by such an event.
And also, it's when you research internet and cybersecurity, there are so many traps. People can mask identity. And I remember many cases when Interpol was looking for instance, particular criminals. And all the IP addresses were from like 60 states together. Now the question is where to go. What's real, what's not real. Also, when you research darknet and those lower entities of internet, there are so many traps, sites set up by secret services from different nations. Because this is sort of sophisticated topic to mask yourself in cyberspace. So you can be whoever you want if you have capabilities and money to do so. So that's a good point when we speak about international relations and what is the impact of that, as you say, dancing in the cyberspace. That was a good expression. I like it. So that's quite sophisticated. Guy, the next question is, and this is quite useful to know, what is the approach of state and private companies to cybersecurity, and how do you see the collaborations in the UK? Do you think that the private companies participate in cybersecurity to extent that is required, or do you think that you need some new norms, maybe new collaborative projects, or some new visions for this?
For a long time now, there's been a recognition that cybersecurity has to be a public-private partnership. That there's some things the state can do at scale that private sector can't do or doesn't have the authority to do. But at the same time, that the state doesn't have the capacity or the resources to, again, be a blue light service. So I think there's an ongoing refinement to the public-private partnership, consolidating it, improving it. For example, I know the NCSC has led kind of a lot of work in this space, but as have other government departments. I think it's integral that that is in place and that we continue to identify ways to leverage that and improve that.
In comparison with different states, like Germany, France, Spain, United States, what's the position of the UK in cybersecurity, as you say, being mature enough to detect the threats, but also to adjust to the new one?
So I think the UK arguably is a leader in this space, but there's only so much that the UK can do unilaterally. I mean, one important factor is that the UK has a very strong services sector, for example, but our technology sector isn't at the same scale that we might see in somewhere like the United States, or possibly Japan. But the United States in particular, in terms of a developer, the main software developers, whether it's Apple, Microsoft, companies like Google and so forth, these are American headquartered companies. And so when we're looking to identify ways to regulate, the kind of cybersecurity related technologies, or the cybersecurity of technologies, it can be really tricky for the UK to kind of take a lead on that. The UK can work in partnership with other countries, but it can't take a lead. So it's if we take a sector like like airplanes, for example, there are very strict governance regimes in place that kind of govern the safety of and the security of aircraft. If you look at automobiles, again, it took time to develop it, but at this point, we have, across the UK, across the European Union, place in the United States, regulatory regimes in place that determine safe car manufacture and including safe seatbelts, airbags, and so on. But all throughout the vehicle, measures in place to ensure that if it gets into a car accident, there's the greatest possible chance that the people in that car will, come out as safe as possible, with few injuries as possible. With cyber, we don't really have that regulation in place. We have cybersecurity standards. There's a range of those available. We can debate whether they're effective or not, but ultimately, we don't have this. We're not in the same regulatory environment that we are in already for those other sectors just already cited. There's a question as to whether we should reach that, whether we can reach that. But I think this is an ongoing debate that countries are now increasingly having. I know the UK is having this discussion. The United States is, if you look at their recent cybersecurity strategy, it hinted at this idea of kind of liability for technology products in a way that we haven't seen them frame that before. We'll have to see. Again, that's a high-level strategy. We'll have to see whether, when we get into the weeds, whether that actually comes through in terms of hard legislation. But that's a debate that's currently taking place on a live level. And it'd be really interesting to see how that plays out. But again, the UK can be part of that discussion, but the UK probably can't lead because, again, the concentration of this space in somewhere like the United States.
Let's move to the international relations and collaboration internationally. And many people ask, for instance, UK is a part of several groups sharing intelligence. And in terms of cybersecurity, if something happens, for instance, you detect an attack coming from Spain, and people ask, so how does it work when there is a clear detection that the attack coming from a different country? Is UK using those special groups for intelligence sharing, or is UK, for instance, contacting the Spanish authorities that if there is a problem, they can work together? Because in a crime, organized crime, usually you have sort of like joint teams of Interpol. So police officers from different countries are coming to one country and they conduct the operation. But in cyberspace, it's more complicated. So how is it, Gareth?
So yes, the answer is, so whether we have bilateral channels, one-to-one, whether we have the Five Eyes, for example, or NATO, there's multiple forums for which these are live discussions. I don't know. Obviously, these things tend to be classified, official, secret, and so forth. I don't know many instances, but I do know of some, which I probably can't name. But there have been occasions where something is happening to a UK asset, and one of our allies gives us a tap on the shoulder to let us know, and vice versa when the UK horizon scanning identifies something happening on a system outside the UK's jurisdiction. Again, we've been able to give our allies a tap on the shoulder. So very much like with kind of terrorism and other security threats, cyber is very similar. Where there is something identified, a risk identified, countries will collaborate and share the intelligence.
Do you have a sort of like is this collaboration based on just intelligence sharing, or you have a special cyber security or cyberspace officers? Because this is another question I got from my students. If there are people sort of like, you have a police officer generally, and is there a cyberspace officer?
It depends on the context. Again, because there's no single point of contact for cyber and there's no single minister for cyber. Again, it's spaced out across multiple portfolios. You might have an instance where, something is a cybercrime incident. The NCA spot that something has happened in the United States. So UK NCA might spot something's happened in the United States, and they give their equivalent, which would be the FBI, a tap on the shoulder, and vice versa. The FBI might spot something and give our NCA a tap on the shoulder, and that will be through kind of established points of contact where they have kind of international liaisons, perhaps, between the agencies. But yeah, likewise, it might be a different issue altogether. It might be a nation state threat based type thing, in which case possibly you might see GCHQ being the point of contact and kind of having reach out or reach in from international partners, between intelligence services. So it can vary.
And this question connects us to the next one, and that's human capabilities. And my question about this topic is your opinion about the quality of education in the UK regarding cybersecurity. Because you as a researcher, you are researching strategies, you're researching cybersecurity incidents, but all of them, they depend on people, capable people, of putting knowledge and know-how to this area. So how do you see this in the UK?
Like most jurisdictions in the world, the UK is playing catch-up. Arguably, across the cybersecurity ecosystem, there are more vacancies, generally speaking, than there are filled posts. It's an ongoing process to fill kind of the technical expertise, promote kind of take-ups of computing science at GCSE, A-level study, into university study, and then into careers. It is an ongoing push. There's an ongoing push to bridge the gender divide. I know it wasn't too long ago that only about 10% of enrollments at computing science degrees in the United Kingdom were female. So a 90%, 10% split, which is it's one of the most severe splits that we have in any kind of field of study, which, again, really needs to be addressed to, again, promote kind of gender equality throughout the kind of study of cybersecurity. But I'd also say that, you don't have to be a technical expert to be able to speak the language of cybersecurity and incorporate it into your role. For example, when I was a university academic, I used to teach a module called Governance and War in Cyberspace, and it was developed for non-technical students, just politics and international relations students predominantly. They use computers and they use the internet every single day of their lives at this point, typically, but they don't always know how it works. So the module will go from here's the basics of how the internet works, here's how it was designed and how that makes it tricky to govern it, and here's all the cyber warfare, cyber espionage, cyber terrorism. Can we have diplomacy? Can we have cyber war treaties and so forth? And some of those students then went on to, I still get the emails occasionally. They went on to get, jobs in the cybersecurity sector. Either they took a conversion course or jump straight in. But you don't necessarily need an advanced technical knowledge to be able to speak the language. And I think organizations, whether they're corporations, whether they're NGOs and charities, increasingly need people who, again, they need technical experts, but often they also need people who know enough and just be able to speak the language and be a kind of go-between between the technical experts and non-technical experts within an organization. So there's a range of skills involved. And yeah, I think it's an ongoing process to bridge that gap.
Those cybersecurity people, they are often considered as those who want to invade the privacy of others. And this is a long-term discussion about how to balance the privacy of citizens with capabilities of government or private companies to get information they need to sort out the attacks. So how do you see the UK cybersecurity versus privacy debate?
So it's a big question. I'd say a lot of people take cybersecurity as a kind of pathway because they want to enhance security, enhance privacy. Often they I don't want to generalize, but they might be quite pro-privacy themselves, ideologically, and they might not necessarily want to infringe upon others' privacy. So there's ways to do it that are ethical. So, for example, there's a you can become a penetration tester, which is where an organization might hire you specifically to break into their systems and then write a report about how you did it and what things they can do to make sure that a kind of motivated adversary couldn't do the same thing that they did. So they're breaching systems. They might be breaching privacy, but they're doing it in a kind of a controlled and ethical way with the consent of the organization that they're targeting. In terms of the broader question about the UK and where we are in terms of balancing privacy with cybersecurity, this is a huge question, and there's lots involved there in terms of, you look at it from the framing of national security and the debates that we had around the Investigative Powers Act that came into force not coming to 10 years ago now. So it's the debates around how do you have checks and balances in place to make sure that privacy of everyday citizens are protected, coming off the back of the Snowden revelations, all the way through to the commercial stuff, which is, what is the right balance of, making sure that companies aren't misusing the data that they hold, aren't, recklessly impacting the privacy of the users, again, governed by legislation such as the GDPR in the United Kingdom and across the European Union. I suppose that, there's an ongoing debate to be had about how to balance privacy and security, how to balance privacy and convenience. Right. Again, the adage is famous that if you're not paying for a service, you're the product. Like the company that is offering the free service is probably taking your data and selling it on to monetize it. So where is the balance there? Ongoing debates to be had there.
Gareth, the last question for today's interview, and that's related to research. What sort of gaps can you see in cybersecurity research based on your experience as a researcher, as a writer? And maybe you can mention a few areas for junior researchers where they can join the research and they can participate in improvements that are required for the cybersecurity.
One of the exciting things about cybersecurity, and from not just from a technical perspective, but also from a kind of interdisciplinary perspective, so kind of thinking holistically about different approaches to understanding cybersecurity, is that this is a very dynamic risk landscape. The nature of technologies we're using change rapidly over quite short periods of time. The nature of the risks that we face change rapidly over quite short periods of time. That means that you're always playing catch up when you're trying to research and analyze these risks, but it also makes it quite exciting, and there's always something new, and it makes every day a little bit new and different. So that, I think, is an attraction to this. It's an ongoing dilemma that we're facing. Arguably, it's kind of I would call it a clash of governance. So, if we think of our way of governing ourselves as like if it was a computing program or an operating system, it's been built up over hundreds of years, from like the 1600s to 1700s and so on. And we have a legislative system where we say, this is, as reasonable human beings, this is how we can operate in society. Here's what we shouldn't do. Here's the laws we abide by. But now we have, in a kind of late 20th into the 21st century, we have an alternative way of governing ourselves: computer code, right? So binary digits, ones and zeros. Lawrence Lessig calls this kind of code is law. But fundamentally, a computer doesn't understand what human law is. The users might, but the computer doesn't. So if you tell a computer to carry out a command and it understands the command, it's not going to check whether it's legal or not. It will just carry out the command. And I think, again, we're always going to be playing catch up. Our ability to design these technologies will probably continue to exceed our governance capacity. That's not to say we should be laissez-faire and just give up. We have to find ways to govern these technologies to maximize the possibilities whilst reducing the risks. And again, because of the dynamic nature, that means it's a really exciting thing to keep pace of. A couple of questions that we're kind of pondering at the moment, and kind of are important questions, I think, for UK PLC, but also international society writ large. There's systems, for example, that were designed in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. In some cases, whether it's, for example, core government systems, or whether it's like the kind of backbone infrastructure of major international corporate banks, often they're still linked up to some of these really, really legacy systems. And they've really struggled to kind of break away because it's such a core backbone of their communication systems internally as an organization. But we're coming to terms with the fact that these systems are increasingly really quite insecure. And it can be a kind of, I would call it a memory level within the computer itself. And this is a really kind of important area where, particularly where it pertains to critical national infrastructure, we're grappling of how do we secure these systems in a responsible way, in an efficient way. Another question would be, okay, if UK PLC experiences hundreds, possibly even thousands of cybercrime attacks, like ransomware, against organizations and against individuals, some of them we know because they get reported. They get reported to the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. Maybe they go for action fraud. Maybe the local police are notified or the NCA are notified. So we build up a threat intelligence picture, but not all of them are notified. Sometimes people are victims of cybercrime and they don't want to report it, or they feel it's taboo. They might feel they get blamed or they're the cause of it, so they don't report it. How do we promote reporting across the UK to build that threat intelligence picture? But also, we don't really have a sense of how impactful on a societal level these incidents are. We can put like a finger to the wind and kind of make a rough assessment, but this can be a really kind of very crude figure. So we need a better picture of how impactful, for example, in costs, these kind of attacks are, so that when we consider debates around ransomware, like, should we ban ransom payments, or, should we restrict ransom payments? Like, we're not ready, arguably, to make either of those decisions. But one of the reasons we're not ready to make that decision is because we don't know what impact a ban, for example, would have on the UK economy. If victims of ransomware just suddenly found that they couldn't legally pay a ransom, we don't know how that would impact the UK economy. So these are kind of quite pressing questions that we have, big questions, but pressing questions, which need more hands on deck, so to speak.
And also, there is one way, and it's free of charge, and it takes 5, sometimes 10 minutes, how you can be better in cybersecurity, and that's just to go to the website, for instance, RUSI, and read articles. They are free of charge, available to everyone, and by accumulating knowledge about how ransomware works, reading about the case studies that are explained on the website in very simple English. You don't need to be expert and you understand what's going on. This also builds sort of self-resilience to those cyber attacks, and it makes your own cybersecurity in much better level than the regular people. So Gareth, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts and interesting ideas you shared with us. And I wish you good luck and lots of energy in your research, because I know it's time consuming, but we are reading your results and articles, and it's good to see that we have institutions like RUSI that it's taking care of this area. So again, thank you for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you very much, Martin. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
See you next time.